I just want to take a moment to thank every single listener of this podcast for following us and paying attention to the psychology and the science we try to bring you on a bi-weekly basis. I know there are a ton of other podcasts out there you could be listening to, and I appreciate you fitting us in among all the true crime you could otherwise be consuming. And with that in mind, today's episode is as close to true crime as we're ever going to get on this podcast. I'm Eric Bollman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. A few weeks ago, I spoke to Dr. Alexandra Zeidenberg about criminal profiling, how it's at best a coin flip for law enforcement, and how people might overrate their own abilities thanks to watching police procedurals and serial killer documentaries. Today, my guest is not a profiler, but he is someone who has lived that true crime sensationalism more closely than most law enforcement and almost any podcast host.
I'm Jeff Smalldon. Glad to be with you this morning, Eric. I'm a retired forensic psychologist. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and my practice over a period of 25 years was located in Columbus, though I did work in about 55 different counties throughout Ohio and in a couple neighboring states as well.
And before we get into the meat of today's podcast, cognizant of the fact that people are going to listen to this a week and a half after we've recorded it, I just wanted to say congratulations on the Detroit Tigers evening up their series and having a pretty big win there yesterday.
I appreciate it, Eric. I slept a lot better last night than I would have had they not won that game.
Well, here's hoping that by the time people listen to this podcast, they will be in the championship series against the Blue Jays and losing at that point.
Here's hoping for the championship series. I'll agree with you that far.
Terrific. So your book, The Beast Was Not Me, talking about conversations that you've had on death row with serial killers and names that we'd be familiar with, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, the Manson family. But I want to start a little bit earlier. You have an anecdote in your book about when you went to Ford Theater as a field trip in grade 3. I want you to tell me about this field trip because I'm thinking about this as sort of a uniquely American thing. Is there a reason to visit Ford Theater aside from the fact that that is where Lincoln was assassinated and that's the historic perspective that you get as a grade 3, 8-year-old, presumably, going to visit that site?
Well, I don't know that there's really another reason for going to that site. That's obviously what it's best known for, the site of Lincoln's assassination. But just a minor correction, it wasn't a school field trip. It was a family trip. My dad was a special agent with the FBI, at the time assigned to FBI headquarters in Washington. And my parents decided to take my older sister and me on a little family trip to Ford's Theater. And what I say in my book is that I was 8 years old and already fascinated by criminals and notoriety and infamy. I don't know why, but after that trip to Ford's Theater, I became obsessed with not the Civil War, not the presidency of Abraham Lincoln, but with the assassination plot, the 8 conspirators who had conspired to assassinate Lincoln and commit a number of associated crimes. And my parents bought a souvenir pamphlet at Ford's Theater that was called The Crime at Ford's Theater. And I just pored over the pages of that in the weeks to come. And, I still have vivid photographs in my brain of all 8 of the conspirators, and I learned all their backgrounds, and I just became fascinated with them. And I don't really understand why, but the point of that anecdote in my book is that from a very early age, I was interested in outlaws and outsiders and criminals.
Yeah, and I guess the reason that stood out to me was that, and to be fair, and I will say I have not had a chance to read your book. I've read reviews of it, which is how I know of these anecdotes, but it struck me as uniquely American all of a sudden. This idea, I know what Ford's Theater is. I know that's where Lincoln was assassinated. I know of that venue. but I live here in Ottawa. In Ottawa, that's the location of the most famous political assassination in Canadian history, which was of one of our fathers of Confederation, Darcy McGee, who was killed on Spark Street. I bet very few people in Ottawa know that even happened. And unless you read the plaque on Spark Street next to the place where that took place, you probably wouldn't know. We don't teach it in school. We don't learn about it. We're not fascinated with it in the same way. There was another assassination in Ottawa of a Turkish diplomat, like machine guns and a crazy scene in the middle of one of the major streets in Ottawa, Island Park Drive. Again, unless you go to the memorial next to that assassination locale, you probably don't know that that took place in your own city here in Canada. And I'm just wondering if there's maybe some, like, I'm hoping you can give me an American perspective on this. It seems like a little bit more part of American culture to talk about these things, to know about these things, the violent incidents in the past.
That's fascinating, actually, hearing your perspective as a Canadian about that and the differences between Canadian culture and American culture. And for one thing, we in America, we're a country saturated with guns, which makes us very different from Canada, obviously. And we're a country that has always celebrated, manifest destiny and conquering and fortunately, those myths, those whitewashed myths about America have increasingly come into question in recent years, and they're no longer, at least should no longer, be presented as the heroic exploits of the American conquerors anymore. But there's this sense of I don't know, we've always celebrated violence, and the outlaw has always played a major role in American mythology, everywhere from, Kit Carson and all the
Right.
cows and uh, so on. So I think, in the modern obsession with these crimes is a continuation of the long time American fascination with guns and violence and conquering.
And
Conquering
you are very upfront about how you developed that fascination at an early age, or how you realized you had it maybe at an early age. Do you think it's something that developed, or do you think that you just saw some of these things and said, "Oh, you know what? That specifically fascinates me. I'm going to pursue that a little bit more." Obviously, as your career went on, you became more and more involved with this, right?
Yeah, one thing, and I mentioned this when you and I talked the other day, having a special agent with the FBI as your dad uh, meant something. My dad was the only father I knew who came home for lunch breaks with a shoulder holster and a gun under his arm. And I remember thinking, that's kind of unusual. I didn't really have a frame of reference, but I thought, I don't think most of my friends' fathers are carrying a gun and a shoulder holster on their lunch breaks. So those images and talk of crime and criminality were in the air I breathed as a kid. Even though my dad was very reticent about his work, he didn't share a lot about it. But I knew that he was on the trail of mafiosos in Niagara Falls. I knew
Right.
enough to do that, and I was fascinated by it. And I used to go to his office with him on Saturday mornings, which was in the post office in Niagara Falls. And he would go up to his office to catch up on paperwork while I would hang out in the lobby of the post office looking at the wanted posters. And I was just I was fascinated by the language in them, how they would rank different criminals from should be considered dangerous, should be considered very dangerous, should be considered extremely dangerous. And of
Right.
course, it was the ones described as extremely dangerous that I was most interested in. And I would read the descriptions of their crimes and was just fascinated by it. But, one other thing, Eric, and I haven't often mentioned this little anecdote when I've talked about my book, but I do think it's significant. My great paternal grandfather, who I had only passing acquaintance with as a kid, but I didn't know him, spent time with him in the years before he died. And he told this story, which again, I was just fascinated by, of being feet away from the assassin who killed President McKinley in Buffalo in 1901, the anarchist Leon Zolgos. And he was there. He was about to shake hands with the president when Zolgos assassinated him. And he talked, he was like 90 years old at the time, and he would talk about watching Zolgos get carted away in what he called the paddy wagon,
Right. Yeah.
called cop cars. And I was fascinated by the proximity to this violent act in American history. And I think that's another thing that played into my developing fascination with crime and outsiders.
Yeah, and I imagine like 1901, right? There aren't a heck of a lot of people who are in close proximity to a crime of that nature at that time. But now you see all the statistics that just about every American has been at least 1 degree separated from a terrible shooting event, some sort of horrific violence that it's almost inescapable now, 100 years later, right?
Right. I mean, it's something that's woven into the fabric of American society, sadly. And I don't see any restrictions on gun ownership coming anytime soon because there's just such a zealous protection of a certain interpretation of the Second Amendment, which suggests that everybody should be allowed to have guns everywhere. And now in Columbus, there's a recent push to allow guns in the state house.
Right.
It's come to that point.
Yeah. Yeah, it is wild to think that's the interpretation that people want to go with, that guns everywhere is somehow better, right? Like,
That people
so,
like don't feel that way, but
right. Now, tell me about the title of your book, The Beast Was Not Me. When I first read that, I immediately had visions of Johnny Cash. Do you know the Johnny Cash song, The Beast in Me? I'm
yes,
guessing that wasn't the genesis of the title, but that was the first thing that popped into my head.
it wasn't. And just a very minor correction. It's actually that beast was not me rather than the
Oh,
beast was not me. But that title comes from the first proper letter Charles Manson ever wrote to me in 1975. I was a 21-year-old, very naive, but very curious senior in college when a professor for a course in abnormal psychology I was taking at the time suggested to me, we both read Helter Skelter, still the best-selling true crime book of all time about the Manson case. And he suggested to me after a hallway discussion following class one day that maybe I should consider writing to members of the Manson family. And it just struck me as an unspeakably bizarre idea at the time.
right.
I never thought of writing to members of the Manson family, though I was fascinated by the case. In fact, as I often point out, just as a way of indicating how obsessive I was and how interested I was in that case, I read Helter Skelter in a single all-night caffeine-fueled binge. Started
Right.
about three one afternoon and ended at about 11 the next day. I couldn't put it down. And so he encouraged me to write members of the Manson family. And there's a long backstory that we don't have time to get into, but much to my surprise, Manson responded to my overture in his first very short letter, basically to say, stop the BS. I don't have time for phoniness and so on. If you really want to communicate with me, tell me who you are, why you're writing me, and quit with the BS. So,
Right.
chas- chastened by that prickly response, I, I tried again. And in my second letter, I was more self-disclosing. I told him I was a senior in college. I had read Helter Skelter. And this was a part of like a hook that I used, not just with Manson, but in other killers later on. I left open the possibility that certain aspects of the Manson story had been distorted in the popular narrative surrounding the case. And so I think Manson thought, okay, well, he's creating a space for me to at least weigh in with my version of the story. And in the next letter he wrote me, he said, that beast was not me, meaning the media portrayal of him, but it's what everyone needs me to be. So they make me up to be a reflection of their own fears, lies, and bullshit. And then he went on in that letter to say, you are my kid, my son, my child, my love, and my reflection. You're being led to the foot of the cross. They'll basically kill you the same way they've killed me. Start a garden wherever you walk. You'll never need any thoughts but your own. Easy, Charles Manson. And so that title, That Beast Was Not Me, always stuck in my mind, both because it stood for repeat killers, resistance against the efforts by other people to categorize them, explain who they are, explain their motives. They're too narcissistic to want to agree to anyone else's definition of who they are. So that beast was not me was sort of an emphatic statement that I'm not who those media commentators say I am. But the other reason I chose that title was throughout my book, one of the themes is how do we exactly calibrate the line that separates those people from the rest of us? Not only, we're fascinated with true crime. People devour stories about these people who've done horrible, unimaginable things, but online, you can also find, I'm just citing a couple of examples here, murderabilia websites whose members trade in these serial killer artifacts and pay
Right.
thousands of dollars for them. And it's like, where actually do you draw the line separating these killers from the rest of us? And I even in my book cite one anecdote that I won't go into the details of unless you ask me, but it was a time during my career when I was asked by many members of the media to offer commentary about work I had done on a serial sniper case because of its possible relevance to another sniper case that was occurring on the national stage. And
Right.
one
That was sorry, that would have been the DC sniper case, I think, right? The one that was happening currently. Yeah.
2002 is when it happened, but the DC sniper or snipers, as it turned out, were still at large when Scott Pelley of 60 Minutes came to Columbus to interview me for a segment on 60 Minutes too. And I've been watching 60 Minutes ever since I was a kid. It's part of my reality. I love that show. And so the opportunity to appear as the featured guest in a episode of 60 Minutes was cool to me.
Right. Yeah.
My ego responded to the opportunity. I thought, oh, that'd be cool to be on 60 Minutes. And so while Pelly was here in Columbus interviewing me, word came through that perhaps the authorities had arrested the DC sniper. And I remember thinking, well, on one hand, I hope they have, because if they have, that'll mean no more people are killed. But if they have arrested the DC sniper, that will immediately kill this show. Like I will,
Right.
they'll
Your interview will be irrelevant now, right?
be irrelevant now. I was being interviewed on Monday morning. The segment was to run on Wednesday evening. And if they arrested the sniper on Monday, my episode would be killed. So my opportunity to appear on 60 Minutes would suddenly go out the window. And I thought, so am I really hoping for an outcome here that would set the stage for more people to be killed by the DC sniper? If
Right.
they
Yeah.
haven't captured him, then my episode will go ahead. and maybe more people will be killed. And I thought, what does that say about me that I let my ego get in the way of hoping for an outcome that might save lives? And as it turned out, they didn't arrest the DC sniper, and the snipers killed somebody else the very next day after my 60 Minutes taping occurred. And
Right.
then they finally arrested the two snipers the day after my Wednesday evening episode appeared on 60 Minutes. But I never forgot that. And I often revisited it over the years and thought, what really does that say about me? Is it some personal pathology, or would most people have felt the same way I felt?
Well, and I think that's kind of in my mind, that's one of the things that fascinates us about killers is this idea that maybe, nobody's all good, nobody's all bad. Maybe there's some, how do you find the good in a killer, but also how do you find the bad in me, right? Like,
Yeah,
do I have that capacity as well? Do all of us have something in us that makes us capable of some, maybe not serial killing, but, capable of doing terrible things under certain circumstances, right?
exactly. Yeah, I think, and it's the contemplation of that question looked at from various angles and in various forms that runs as a leitmotif throughout my book, sort of, interrogating that idea that you can very clearly separate us, so-called normal people, the majority population, from people who commit horrendous crimes. And this fascinated me years ago. My doctoral dissertation at Ohio State was on, I called it the social construction of apparently motiveless murder, interpretive frameworks and conceptual something. I can't remember the word in the title. But the idea,
Doctoral theses are always very long, right? Like, yeah.
they're usually not words that immediately come to mind 30 years later. Uh, but anyway, there was I was interested in how different knowledge communities, both lay and professional, talk about and seek to explain acts of murder that don't fall into the traditional taxonomy used to describe why people kill each other: greed,
Right.
political gain, lust, revenge, and so on. What about these so-called motiveless crimes that appear to have occurred in a vacuum? And one of the chapters in my dissertation was about the valuation of killing. Like, and I raised the question, but like, what about the corporate executive who willfully disregards rules that are in place to preserve the safety of his workers? He disregards those
Right.
rules with the motive of making more money, and his workers end up getting killed for it. We don't think of that person in the same way we think about people who act according to a more private logic and kill multiple people over a period of time.
Right. And we don't treat them the same in the criminal justice system either.
I
And
don't know.
that's always fascinated me too. And not just, the factory owner who, makes things unsafe for his workers because he's less concerned with that than he is the bottom line. But I mean, even corporate entities who make decisions they know will result in the deaths of people. Maybe a pharmaceutical company that raises the price of their drugs so high that they know people can't get it and they know those people will die. Or governments that make a decision to cut funding to something that they know will result in death, but it's the politically expedient thing to do, right? Like we certainly don't treat that. The media doesn't treat it the same way. The courts don't treat it the same way.
You've actually given an excellent capsule summary of the issue at the center of my um, not only my dissertation, but certainly my book. That beast was not me. In different ways, I raised that question throughout the book. And like we don't refer to those people you just described as killers. We don't even think
No,
of them that way.
right.
So I've always been fascinated by that question, kind of the different ways we think of people whose acts result in the same thing, the deaths of other people.
Now, here's something that specifically fascinates me, and I'm sorry to take on a tangent here, but you were talking, you're in college. They suggest that you write to the Manson family, and you think, what a ridiculous idea, but okay, I'll do it anyway. And then they do write back. They actually, start corresponding with you. They seem to be willing to talk. If you look at, all the TV shows where somebody goes to interview a killer, they seem very willing to talk, and, they want to expound about the murders they've committed or whatever it is. And when I was in college, I was in radio college, and we had an assignment to reach out to, we were assigned specific radio personalities who were big radio personalities in Canada, and we were going to do profiles on them. How did they get to be where they are? And I won't say the name, but I reached out to a very prominent radio personality in Canada. Now, at the time, it was email, so it's easier to be dismissive maybe of an email than a physical letter. But the response I got was, kid, I don't have time for this. Like, leave me alone, right? Basically. And I thought, okay, that makes sense, right? And you probably get inundated with a bunch of emails and you can just dismiss this one. But I'm wondering if there's something in, the people that you talk to, the killers that you talk to in prison, are they more willing to talk? Do they want to talk? Or is it more having to pry things out of them? If you're trying to achieve a certain aim, right? You're trying to determine whether or not they have a mental illness, or you're trying to determine whether they're fit to stand trial. You have a specific goal when you go in there. And I'm wondering if the portrayal of the serial killer who just wants to tell everyone about all the things that he's done, that we see on TV is an accurate one.
Well, it's an interesting question. I've written some of these contacts with very notorious killers. Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, took place before I became a psychologist. So I wasn't evaluating them in any formal sense, wasn't trying to engage them with an eye toward determining competency or mental state at the time of the offense.
Okay.
That wasn't part of my agenda. I was just trying to engage them in hopes that they would enter into a dialogue with me that in the end would offer some insights into the kind of person who commits the kinds of crimes that you
Right.
were committing. And one, and I'll get back to the meat of your question in a second, but for people who haven't read my book, the first chapter in my book is about a very bizarre double homicide that occurred in the hospital in Columbus, where I was then an administrator. And these two women were killed between 4:30 and 5:05 on a Friday afternoon in a department I had responsibility for, right around the corner from the hospital's main corridor. And no one saw anyone enter or leave the lab. The police didn't arrest anyone. And it was against that background that I made my decision to enroll at Ohio State and begin work toward my PhD with an eye toward becoming a forensic psychologist. But the reason I bring that up, when I wrote to Ted Bundy in 1985, he was on death row in Florida, and then John Wayne Gacy in 1986, he was on death row in Illinois. Those crimes at the hospital were still unsolved. So I was hoping, naively maybe, that people like Bundy and Gacy, who I knew a lot about serial killing
Right.
and, and about the ability to seemingly dissolve into thin air after a lot of their murders. They were very effective in the sense that they eluded detection for a long period of time because they had such a well-crafted social persona that enabled them to move among people who didn't suspect them of being killers. So, very interesting story. I'll give it in very condensed terms. I was just beginning graduate school in 1985 when I decided to write Ted Bundy, thinking if I could succeed in engaging him in a conversation, maybe, at least indirectly, he would provide me with some information that would help me understand the kind of person who would have committed these two murders at the hospital where I worked. And at the end of my long letter to Bundy, I said, and he would have known from reading my letter that I knew a lot about his case. I'd read four or
Right.
five books about it. I was pretty conversant about his case. But I said at the end of the letter, if you don't write me back, you'll never hear from me again. I'm not trying to bother you. Your choice.
Right.
And he didn't write me back. So I thought, well, like
Right.
the radio personality you were trying to engage, he's not interested. But then exactly a year later, I get this letter from him telling me that he had just uncovered my letter, as he put it, amongst my papers. And he had decided to respond. And he said, as for all those questions you asked me, I thought they were very thoughtful and interesting. I'll only tell you this, I've never felt better in my life than I feel right now, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And I'm thinking, that's interesting. You're under two death sentences, and,
Right.
you're at the peak of your life, at least according to the picture you're presenting me. And then the sign off was the most interesting part of his letter. And I later came to understand it as what I call the serial killer's tease. They're all about the game of cat and mouse and cleverness and so on. And Bundy knew that I knew that his signature characteristic was the unfathomable distances that he would travel in search of his victims. Killed people in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, finally Florida. So he signs off his letter. Take care, watch yourself, travel light. Peace, Ted. I remember thinking, he's blowing me off in a way, but he's also teasing me. Like he thought he was being very clever and he knew that I would get the joke. So, and I never wrote him back. But so he didn't disclose much. He wasn't in the mood for self-disclosure or talking about the crimes that he had been convicted of committing. Gacy, on the other hand, Gacy began the same way with a prickly letter saying, if you think you know anything about me as a result of reading those books, you're dead wrong. And I thought, oh, this doesn't sound like a guy in the mood for opening up about his crimes. But he
Right.
left at the end of the letter, he said, write me back. So I did. And he and I ended up corresponding on average every 2 weeks for 3 calendar years. So we exchanged many, many letters. I went to visit him twice on death row in Illinois. And he was very interesting in terms of the question you pose about their willingness to talk. He could talk all day. And frankly, talking to him often became a wearying exercise because he was so self-absorbed and so unwilling to accept responsibility for the crimes he had committed. But I sometimes use the phrase performative inscrutability. He would say, I'm not that person, like Manson, that beast was not me. I'm not that person you've been reading about in the press. In fact, he greeted me the first time I met him in person by saying, I know, you're here to see the monster, but now you're going to meet the man. That's
Right.
he signed in. And so he was very willing to talk, but not willing to accept responsibility for much of anything.
Right. So yeah, he wants somebody who's there who he can,
Manipulate.
regale with his cleverness, but not necessarily divulge anything of substance if he can help it. Right.
Exactly. And when I would get close, he told me he knew something about five of the 33 murders he had been convicted of committing. And so I would try to draw him out. And by the way, I learned early on how prickly he was and how narcissistic, prickly in the way of a narcissist. They don't like to be challenged
Right.
and so whenever I did challenge him, he would become very prickly and dismissive. So I had learned to tread carefully with him, but I was trying to draw him out on the five murders that he told me he knew something about. And he would say, that punk was addicted to drugs. I was trying to help him, so and so. And, he worked for me for a while. And I said, but didn't he end up in the crawl space under your house? And he would say, I can't talk about that. My lawyers tell me I can't go there. So he had a convenient way of ending conversations when he wanted to end them.
I see a lot of people today use that as a convenient way. Oh, lawyers won't let me talk about that. It's, yeah, the catch-all, right?
I tried and true exit ramp.
Yes. Now, just out of curiosity, you actually went to visit him in person. Who do they let in the prison to visit these people? Presumably, they'd have an endless number of guests, and the fan people who are on these murderabilia websites or whatever. They'd have an endless parade of people in there if they allowed it. How do they make the determination that yeah, you're good, you can come in and see John Wayne Gacy, but this runner of a fan club or whatever can't? Or do they let the fan club runner in as well? I don't know.
An interesting question. I don't think anybody's ever asked that question of me before, but it's an interesting one. Times were different. Like this is back in the 80s. And, with streaming platforms and the endless number of shows on Netflix and Prime about conversations with Bundy, conversations with Gacy, Charles Manson, I think people feel much more familiar with those stories. Maybe there are a lot more people now who might request the opportunity for an audience with Sir Gacy. But back in the 80s, when I was operating, it wasn't the same scene. I don't think there were anywhere near as many people. And a lot of people, at least back then, before they even attempted to go visit a notorious killer like Gacy, I think assumed they wouldn't be able to. Surely they don't just allow anybody to go into the prison.
Right.
I was kind of amazed that I was able to get a letter to Charles Manson and that he wrote me back
Yeah.
that he was accessible in that way. I had previously thought these people were off limits and so on. But this is interesting. When I Gacy invited me to come and visit the prison, visit him in prison. And he said, now, when you come, be sure that you don't sign in as a psychologist because they'll never let you in if you do that. And be sure you don't sign in as a journalist because they'll never let you in if you do that. Say you're my friend. So that's how I signed in at the security desk at the front of the prison, that I was Gacy's friend, and that opened the portal. At least back then in 1986, they allowed me to see him.
Right. Wow, that's super interesting that psychologist would be off limits or journalist off limits. But, if you're buddies, then yeah, by all means, come on in. I feel like it'd be sort of the opposite today if it were that situation to arise, right? All right. So the one other thing that I wanted to ask about is you're talking in the book, you're corresponding with the Manson family, Squeaky from, I don't know how to pronounce that, the name, and the women who are part of Manson's entourage. And I've always thought of Charles Manson as a little bit different than the serial killers that we hear about, right? The Ted Bundy guys and the John Wayne Gacy's, in that feels to me, his story feels to me more like that of a cult leader who just wanted that kind of power. And when you have the power to convince people to commit murder for you, is there any greater power than that? And that seemed to be what he was going for. And you say at some point in your book you had to stop corresponding with them because it was like they were trying to recruit you into this cult that committed these heinous acts, to presumably have you be part of whatever whatever the ethos was that they were trying to put out there into the world, and that you had to cut off communication as a result. Walk me through that. I presume, start talking to them the same way you do everyone else, and it turns at some point.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question. It's a fascinating chapter for me in the history of my involvement with these people. I reached out to Squeaky. I've heard it both as From and Fromy, so I'm not exactly
Okay. Right.
who one is, but I usually say From. But I reached out to her, and I had to use some there's a backstory to how I found her. I had no idea where she was. I only knew she wasn't in prison. But I did find her. My letter landed in her mailbox. She was living in an attic apartment in Sacramento with another devoted Manson disciple, her best friend, Sandy Good. And I was sort of shocked anew, just as I had been with Manson, that she responded right away to my letter. And the first thing I noticed was the floral accented envelope that her letter came in, and her stationery was similarly floral. And she wrote in this big loopy handwriting that reminded me of a lot of handwriting I saw from middle school girls back in the day. And her first letter was all talk of harmony, peace, love. She said, you know, those of us who lived on the ranch, Spahn Ranch outside LA, together were joined together by our sense of love and community. And she said at one point during the letter, Charlie didn't do it, Jeff. He is it, suggesting that he was, you know, sort of this spiritual presence who could deliver the world from all of its sins if only the world would allow him to do that and not keep him in prison. And I thought, well, this is unusual. Not exactly. I knew the Manson family initially had been steeped in this hippie ethos, but before the murders. But this surprised me. I didn't expect Manson's second in command, which everyone recognized Squeaky as, to present in this way, love, harmony, and so on. So I continued corresponding with her and her roommate Sandy. And over the course of 2.5 months, there was a very interesting progression in their letters. The first couple continued in that same style, hippie lingo, and so on. And both women were very articulate, by the way, obviously intelligent. And then I got a letter from Sandy Good one day in either late May or early June. This was 1975. And the first sentence in the letter was, we're moving out of the realm of words. And
Okay.
I remember thinking, I don't want to move out of the realm of words.
Right.
The only realm I want to be in with you. But then she proceeded in that letter to talk about how LA was set for destruction and bad karma was coming the way of Los Angeles. And there was just this ominous tone that ran throughout the letter that got my attention. And I thought, okay, this is moving toward a place I don't want to go. And then the next letter, which was, I remember very clearly, it was dated June 30th, said, we want you to help us. And they had said, we want you to help us before, but now we want you to help us in some very concrete ways. We want you to call the heads of corporations who are contributing to environmental pollution. We want you to threaten them over the phone. And we want you to tell them, you need to stop doing what you're doing, or Manson will come for your heads. And if they say Manson, tell them, remember Sharon Tate? That was the first explicit reference to the Tate LaBianca murders that had occurred 6 years prior. And that letter went on through 16 handwritten pages to say things like, if people don't act in accordance with the directives that you give them, acting as our representative, tell them their arms will be chopped off. And she tried to tell me to recruit my friends to go out in the woods and kill hunters and leave signs on the trees saying there are hunters hunting hunters. And when I got that letter, I thought, okay, Jeff, now you're in way over your head. You need to find an exit ramp now. And I did. There's a whole backstory to how I managed to accomplish that, but I did find an exit ramp. And then just a little over 2 months later, the headline screamed across the country, Squeaky Fromm, Manson disciple attempts to assassinate President Ford in
Right.
Sacramento. And my dad was still in the FBI, and the FBI found a cache of my letters in Squeaky Fromm's apartment and notified my dad's boss in Buffalo, gee, Jack, we're not sure what this is about, but the FBI in Sacramento found a bunch of letters in Squeaky Fromm's apartment from someone named Jeff Smalldon, and he's using the same address where you live because I had been conducting this correspondence over the summer from my parents' address. I was
Right.
so creating a little bit of an awkward situation for my dad.
Did it make for an uncomfortable Thanksgiving?
Not really. My dad was cool. I have to say that for him. I think he thought I was nuts, but he never told me I couldn't do this. He understood why I was writing to these people. And I think he said something like, Jeff, why? Why are you doing this? But I mean, he asked that question rhetorically, even though he knew why I was doing it.
Right.
But he thought I was a little nuts, but he didn't tell me I couldn't do it.
Yeah. And I, as this correspondence goes on, do you think that it was that they once you reached out the first time, they thought, oh, here's someone who's interested in what we've done. Therefore, they might be amenable to joining our cause. And from the beginning, they thought that that was the way to go. Or do you think that at some point they thought, okay, we have a shot to recruit one more person? I mean, are they doing these things themselves? Are they calling and threatening the heads of, oil companies? Are they trying to go out in the woods and assassinate hunters themselves? Or are they just trying to create as much chaos as possible by recruiting as many people as possible?
Well, they weren't going out in the woods and killing hunters, but Sandy Good eventually went to prison for sending threatening letters through the U.S. mail to corporation heads. She did a number of years in federal prison for that exact thing. Of course, Squeaky Fromm went to prison for attempting to assassinate the president. But I think, in response to your question, I think when I made the initial overture to them, I think they wondered whether I might be malleable to their recruitment strategies. And I think I got a front row seat to the kind of grooming process that Manson used to amass his group of followers and that his followers used to recruit more people and expand the number of Manson family sympathizers or devotees. But I think they felt me out initially. They asked me to send them a picture of myself. They wanted to know about me. And they asked me explicitly, tell us about you. And I remember when they asked for a picture, I thought, I don't really think I want to send them a picture of me. But I consulted one of my friends and he said, oh, yeah, you should do that. Send them a picture, but make sure it's a picture that doesn't look anything like you look now. So that's what I did. I sent them a picture, but it didn't look anything like I looked then. But I
Like
think
your grade nine yearbook photo?
like that.
Yeah.
But I think they saw that as an indication from me that I was interested in sharing my personal experiences with them. Maybe I was vulnerable to their appeals. And it didn't happen overnight that they started basically demanding that I do these things on Manson's behalf. By the way, I knew Manson was directing all of their communications with me. They would talk, they would tell me sometimes like, we read your letter while we were seated in the warden's office at Folsom Prison, trying to convince him to let us in to see Charlie. So I knew Manson knew of our correspondence and that he was directing them. But yeah, I think they gradually tried to reel me in. And then as they were becoming more desperate in May and June of that year, their appeals to me became more desperate and unhinged. And that's when they began ordering me to, make these threats, explicit threats to people. And the assassination attempt came only 2 months later, about as clear a sign as you could get that they were, in
Right.
fact, at about the end of their tether.
Well, and that's one of the things that, and I could be wrong about this, but my understanding is that so many of the people who had been part of what they would call the Manson family initially remained devotees for decades after the fact. And you would think, like, with some separation, okay, he's in prison, you're not, you can, somehow rebuild a life and go on and do rational things that most people do. But they remained really, really committed to this whole thing right up until the end, from what I understand.
Well, yes and no. I mean, over the years, they peeled off different, even someone as notorious as Susan Atkins, who of the Manson women was the most notorious for her participation in both the Tate murders and then the next night, the LaBianca murders. She peeled off in the mid 70s. I also corresponded at length with her. She peeled off other the other two of the main three who had been participants in the murders, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten, they peeled off as well. The one who never, I mean, Sandy Good, I think even today is still a Manson disciple, even though he died about 8 years ago. I saw a rare online interview with Squeaky Fromm recently, just within the last few years, maybe a little longer back than that, but not much. And she's quite she's not elderly, but she's probably in her late 70s now. And at the end of that interview, she said, "Was I in love with Charlie? Yeah, I was. I still am."
Wow. Yeah.
So
Like that is remarkable to me, just the staying power of something like that, given the separation, given the distance, given the time, and given all the context that you now have that might make you see things differently, right?
exactly. Though I would think that probably Squeaky and others of her ilk looked back on that relatively brief time period with Manson as the most stimulating, exciting period of their lives. Manson, for all of his horrible qualities, was extremely charismatic. I mean, if
Right.
you've any of his interviews with Geraldo Rivera, Charlie Rose, Diane Sawyer. He's very charismatic. And when he turns on that charisma, I think his disciples saw him as the most interesting, entertaining, provocative person that they had ever met. And of course, Manson was a career con man with a fifth grade education who'd grown up in the prisons and juvenile facilities, and he was an institutionalized man, but he learned a lot about how to get along and how to influence people during those years incarcerated. And then he was released into 1967, the summer of love, with all these young disaffected people who were looking for direction, and he just thought he had died and gone to heaven when he encountered that following his release from prison. And people like Squeaky Fromm and Sandy Good quickly fell in line once they encountered him.
Yeah. I remarkable that it still holds as much weight as it did then today, that we all know the story and that they're still making TV shows and movies about it, and Quentin Tarantino's doing stuff about it, right? Like, it's remarkable uh, how prevalent, or I guess how prominent in pop culture all of that still is now, right?
It is. I totally agree with you. It's amazing that that story has the staying power that it has, but it has all the ingredients of a lurid story, a fascinating, very charismatic leader. It's got sex, drugs, celebrity, Hollywood. It's just got all of these elements of a story that people continue to find compelling all these many years later.
And now you've written a story of your own personal reflections as you speak to some of these very notorious people that the names that we know, and just your own personal reflections on it. That beast was not me. When people read your book, what do you want them to take away from it?
Well, I wrote that book wanting to be a very relatable, totally non-academic person with a lot of good stories to tell. And it's my story. It's a memoir first, a true crime book second. I would say it's a memoir, but a memoir saturated in true crime because
Right.
my 5 decades of interactions with Manson, Bundy, Gacy, and I worked throughout during my career on about 300 death penalty cases. So I spent my career working with very violent offenders. And there's quite a bit in my book, though, quite a bit in my book about my career. Like there's one chapter devoted to a notorious serial murder case here in Ohio, for which I was the defense psychological consultant. So my career certainly factors into the story that I tell, but the story that I tell goes far beyond just my career. And the tone of the book is very, I tried to make it conversational. As I said, I wanted to be a relatable narrator. I didn't want to be writing as some pompous, expert. It was basically, though I said that I was a board certified forensic psychologist, which I am, I was. So it's informed by my expertise as a forensic psychologist, but it's in no way an academic treatise. It's my story.
Conversational and self reflective, much as our conversation has been today. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me on, Eric. I've enjoyed talking to you.
And for our listeners who want, the link to the book is in the show notes, so you can go there and check it out right now. Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
All right, Eric. Thanks very much.
All right, thanks. Take that. That was terrific. I appreciate you being accommodating with my Zoom limitations.
No, no, no. It was good. I mean, I hope you think that it was good for your purposes. It was fun.
Yeah, yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. And hey, go Tigers.
A very good interviewer, by the way. I mean, you're a very welcoming, kind of conversation facilitating interviewer. So it was fun talking to you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I hope it comes across in the podcast when people listen to it.
One thing I didn't mention to you, Eric, years ago, I thought of this when you were talking about your attempt to engage the attention of a well-known radio personality.
Yeah.
Hopefully, this person I'm about to mention wasn't the one you tried to engage. But do you know Mary O'Connell and the program Ideas?
It's familiar, but I couldn't tell you if no, I know the name, but I don't know anything about the program.
Many years ago, in fact, I looked this morning. Mary was very nice to me, so I couldn't imagine she was the one you were talking
Yeah.
about. But she was apparently, my understanding was she was a very well-known Canadian journalist. This would have been back in the 90s. And she was the host of this program called Ideas, which I was led to believe was, kind of like the Canadian equivalent of 60 Minutes, though it wasn't, it was radio, it wasn't television. But she invited me to be a guest on this series she did called Creating Conscience, where Robert Hare was another guest on the
Okay.
program.
Yeah.
She gave me an opportunity to talk about my interests, not just academic interests, but kind of the serial killer and popular culture and so on. But I really enjoyed her. She's a really nice person during the entire time of my contact with her. I don't know what she's doing now or if she's probably retired.
I I associate her name with the TV program W5, which I would say is sort of Canada's equivalent, maybe not of 60 Minutes, but of what's that other news magazine show?
48 hours,
That's
Dateline.
yes, one not a Dateline, but like a 48 hours kind of thing would be the Canadian equivalent of that ran on CTV. And I think she was a correspondent for them for at least a few years. I graduated from radio school in the early 2000s, and I think that would have been when she was on that program.
I'll
So
have to Google her and get an update because, as I said, I really liked her a lot, but I lost track of her after that series.
yeah, yeah, and I remember the show. I think it was a CBC show, Ideas, but I think it didn't last past her departure. I think they replaced that with a show called Q, which still runs today and has had numerous hosts over the years. But
Interesting.
yeah,
Just one way of dating it. I looked because I've got it. She sent it to me after in a case. Six. My point is, they're cassettes, not CDs, cassettes.
yes.
I get six cassettes that were the whole creating conscience program. So that's how long ago.
That's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric. It's great talking to you.
And thanks to you at home for listening, downloading, streaming, and reviewing today's episode. Mindful is available wherever you get your podcasts. And That Beast Was Not Me, One Forensic Psychologist, 5 Decades of Conversations with Killers, is available wherever you get your books. And at the link in the show notes. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bollman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery. And our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.